Meg, just go ahead. You know what you're doing. Go ahead.
Let it roll. Okay. Over to us. Well, that was a wonderful introduction, John, and thank you for those comments. Really interesting. And I have to say, this is one sight I never thought I would see from the podium at Charleston. It was quite impressive from up here. So, well done, all. Good afternoon, and welcome to our final plenary session of the day. We're going to spend the next hour or so, as John said, discussing one of the hottest topics in higher education today, massive open online courses, or as they are affectionately known, and somewhat awkwardly known, really, as MOOCs. My name is Meg White, and I'm joined today by a group of experts who will share a few comments to get us started, and then we will open the floor for your questions. And John will make sure to answer all your questions, even in our limited time today, so no worries. This is designed to be interactive, so I don't need to tell this audience what that means. Please, as our panelists are making their comments, note your questions, and you'll have time to have a discussion with these folks and with each other before we close the session today. So let me get on with the introductions of the panel this afternoon. I'm joined by Meredith Schwartz, who is the Senior Editor of News and Features at Library Journal. And Meredith will provide us with some background and discuss the current MOOC landscape, which is changing every day, quite frankly. Lynn Sutton, who is Dean at the Z. Smith Reynolds Library at Wake Forest University, who will talk with us about how her library is leveraging this technology even today. And then finally, Rick Anderson, who is Associate Dean for Scholarly Resources and Collections at the Marriott Library at the University of Utah, who will give us some takeaways and hopefully some practical advice on what the future looks like for us as we return to our day-to-day after Charleston. So without further ado, I'm going to take a seat and pass the baton to Meredith. Thank you. Can you hear me?
What's a MOOC is the reaction I got from many librarians when I was researching an article called Massive Open Opportunity, which we published. How about now? Okay. So, I was nervous about public speaking, but then when I saw all you people do YMCA, it just got better. So, what's a MOOC? That's the reaction I got from most of the librarians I talked to when I was researching an article called Massive Open Opportunity, which we published last May. At the time, MOOCs were already on the radar of higher education pundits, but not many of the classes had actually started, particularly outside of the STEM fields. However, by the time the finished article appeared only a few months later, MOOCs had already started to enter the public consciousness, or to put it another way, they'd started approaching the peak of the Gartner hype cycle. They were being touted as the solution to democratizing higher education in the face of rising costs, lifelong learning, college readiness, continuing education, grocery shopping, everything. Librarians were hungry to know what this hot new development meant for the library. And the answer seemed to be they have several hats to wear, supporting production of MOOCs, student use, dissemination, assessment, and preservation. So, by far the most mature role for librarians was being a materials matchmaker, finding materials that could be made accessible to classes numbering in the thousands, most of whom wouldn't pay anything or were unable to pay anything, and they weren't matriculated students, so they did have no access to institutional holdings in print or electronic formats. So librarians got in the business of helping faculty hunt down OA materials, which would serve the same functions as the text that professors were used to using. Some librarians also found that this had the side effect of encouraging more faculty members to make their own work open access. When that didn't work, they had to start negotiating for those traditionally published materials. At the time, that really wasn't happening very often. Okay. But in the last few months, publishers have begun partnering with MOOC providers to offer content to students at no charge. Notable examples include Coursera, which is doing a pilot with Cengage, Macmillan Higher Ed, Oxford University Press, Sage, and Wiley. And Elsevier is running a free textbook pilot with students in 5 MOOCs that are run by edX, which is a nonprofit MOOC provider. Meanwhile, digital courseback producer Sipix, Heather, are you here? Crossed the MOOCs must be free barrier by helping libraries offer content to MOOC students for a few dollars per article or chapter. Here Here we give a shout out to some of those materials. And if you download the slides afterwards, all of these are live links. Professors, especially those already used to flipping their classrooms, want to include, did I skip a slide? No. Professors, especially those already used to flipping their classrooms, want to include not just videos of their own talking heads, but images, music, and other videos in their MOOC presentations. So figuring out what counts as fair use is another library bailiwick. Because MOOCs have such large audiences, are not part of a traditional educational institution, are sometimes provided by for-profit companies, even if the professor and the librarian are working for a nonprofit university, and are viewed in countries with weaker protections for fair use, some of the safe harbors that faculty has counted on for educational purposes are weaker or non-existent. All this material, by the way, shamelessly stolen from the OCLC symposium in March. So that doesn't mean that we're restricted to only public domain, open access, or publisher-provided materials. The key is to use only the smallest portion of the material that you need for the pedagogical point. Don't include the whole Monty Python skit to get to the punchline, only include the part that you actually need, and you have a much stronger case. So the next role is pieces of the production puzzle. Libraries are helping professors produce MOOCs literally, providing the recording and editing equipment. In one case, they even, of course, the tech support. In one case, they even provided a live studio audience because the professor felt that the lectures weren't working without people to laugh on cue. So the next phase is MOOCs for librarianship, for use within the profession, whether for paraprofessionals, for library school students, or for librarians who want continuing education. This didn't make it so much into the article, but since the article was published, there have been 3 MOOCs run by LIS instructors. David Lankes of Syracuse University presented his new librarianship masterclass, which was unusual compared to most MOOCs because it required that the students purchase a textbook at a discount. And it also offered MLS or continuing education credit to students who paid a fee and completed the examinations. Michael Stevens, who, full disclosure, is an LJ columnist as well as a San Jose State University instructor, taught his Hyperlink Library MOOC. We're going to do an article on it in December with more detail, but one of the things that was interesting about that is that it was capped. It was not actually massive. It was only 500 students allowed. Of those, he says over 300 were active participants, so they also had a much smaller drop-off rate than many MOOCs show. It was also not run by Coursera or edX or one of these MOOC provider intermediaries. It was run through BuddyPress, which is an offshoot of WordPress. Finally, Jeffrey Pomerantz of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill ran his course on metadata through Coursera. But although he is an LIS instructor, that course was not primarily aimed at a librarian audience. It was aimed to teach the general public about metadata. And I suspect that the interest was benefited by the fact that right around when this was happening, Edward Snowden's revelations about metadata were entering the public consciousness. So, MOOCs in the public library is a still developing area. There's widespread agreement in principle that MOOCs offer a good opportunity for public libraries to build educational programming without having to recruit local experts. But as of May, I'd only found one public library that was actually doing it. And that's the County of Los Angeles Public Library, which included MOOCs into the Center for Learning Initiative of its new strategic plan. Since then, the Ridgefield, Connecticut Library used a Coursera MOOC on the fiction of relationship from Brown University as the centerpiece of its adult summer reading programs. We're going to cover that one in December, too. And a student in the Hyperlink Library MOOC created a detailed plan to implement a MOOC club at Oregon's Corvallis-Benton County Public Library. But at this point, theoretical discussions about why this is such a great idea really seriously outnumber places that are actually doing it. Of course, we have no way to track how many students are using their public libraries on an individual basis to access MOOC content. Libraries are also starting to produce MOOCs of their own. You'll hear a lot more about that from Lynn in a minute. But I also wanted to call out New York Public Library's Sinology 101 MOOC, which was taught by Raymond Pun when he was there. He's now gone to NYU Shanghai. He also presented on it at LJ's Digital Shift Conference a couple weeks ago, and that's up online for free if you want to watch his presentation. That's where I stole the slide from. And across the pond, the British Library has signed up with UK-based MOOC provider FutureLearn to create its own MOOCs based on its own materials. So now we're into very largely uncharted territory, roles for the library and MOOCs. Assessment. How to assess the success of a MOOC is a really unanswered question at this point. Without any filtering for readiness before people come into the classes or any credentialing incentive at the end, dropout rates are huge. 90% is the number most commonly thrown around. I've heard it as high as 98% of the people who drop out. The thing is, though, the enrollments are so huge to begin with that even 10% left can be more students than that professor can teach in a working lifetime. So is that successful? It's not clear whether students' learning goals are even well measured by completion or whether they are getting what they need and that's why they're dropping out. And of course, the university's goals in terms of prestige or Coursera's goals in terms of profit may not relate to those metrics at all. So it's hard to say libraries should participate in assessment when we don't really know what we're assessing, but I will say the growing role of libraries as data wranglers indicates that maybe there's a place for us there when we figure out what we're measuring. The next role, which I think is bigger, is preservation. Preservation of MOOCs material is the key challenge because most MOOCs are presented by third-party providers, many of whom, since they're for-profits, may shake out as the category matures. And when they go away, what's going to happen to that content? Even the ones that stay viable, they don't really have incentive to keep obsolete versions around and make them available for study. When the professor improves a class, they're not going to offer the 6 pre-improved classes. So if you're a scholar studying MOOCs, you need that material preserved somewhere. It's important that libraries claim a place at the table in negotiations with those providers to make sure that that content can be preserved. Creative Commons is urging that MOOC providers use CC licenses in part because it enables preservation. Also, the advantage to doing it now, there still aren't that many MOOCs. I believe 493 is the last number I saw. So if we can get a preservation structure going, we can apply it without having to have a massive backlog of content. Very recently in the UK, someone named Russell Boyett run the Repository Fringe Developer Challenge with a proposal to build a MOOC preservation toolkit, which would reach into MOOCs, particularly open source ones, put them together with social media interactions around the same content, and use SWORD to push it into a repository together. So, back to the Gartner hype cycle. Today, MOOC excitement seems to have begun the slide into MOOC skepticism. Faculty have raised concerns about who owns the intellectual property being offered in MOOCs, and about MOOCs having the potential to reduce the diversity of scholarship to a few rock star professors from brand name institutions. Concerns have also been raised about how well MOOCs actually work to democratize education. A study by Columbia University's Community College Research Center found that all students perform less well in online courses than they do in person, and the gap is wider among those with lower GPAs, men, and African American students. When San Jose State and MOOC provider Udacity offered several 4-credit courses online to high-risk students, pass rates were dramatically lower than in-person rates for not-at-risk student population. These concerns have led to experiments with tweaking the format of MOOCs, from a distributed open collaborative course billed as a feminist anti-MOOC, to SPOCs, which is small private online courses, and even Smooches, which is synchronous massive open online conference. I swear I did not make that up. They've also led to calls for embedded librarians, or library students doing virtual internships, to provide support to MOOC students as they would for students in a paying online program or on a physical campus. However, as Forrest Wright pointed out in a DLib article, even in online courses with paying courses with limited enrollment, time demands have been a challenge for this kind of support. So personalized one-on-one reference assistance is probably not happening for MOOCs at this point. What we can do, though, is to create scalable options like LibGuides and tutorials that are MOOC focused and don't point to institutional holdings that those students can't access, and then reach out to faculty to make sure those are included in the course resources. This is a fast-moving field. It's so fast-moving that there are 2 things I want to include on this that happened after I finalized the slides. So in addition to these, EDUCAUSE has recently released a massive MOOC review, which I highly recommend. And Coursera is launching an overseas physical locations to take MOOCs in. I'm not exactly sure how that's not a college, but we can talk about that later. MOOCs raise at least as many questions for higher education and for libraries as they answer. They may ultimately end up with floppy disks on the list of technological innovations that briefly transform their industries only to be supplanted. Or they may become ubiquitous and eventually give rise to the next generation of learning tools. Already there are calls to disaggregate the MOOC, turning it from a course into more of a course pack or a library for the flipped classroom. We can't hang back to see where MOOCs end up any more than the right answer in the 1990s would have been to ignore floppy disks, because they matter now, regardless of where they're going. Supporting MOOC production is fast becoming a core library role at many institutions, and stretching beyond that to supporting use, dissemination, assessment, and preservation gives libraries an opportunity to help shape developing policy and priorities. That's all she wrote. Thank you.
Okay. I am Lynn Sutton from Wake Forest University, and I have many opinions about MOOCs in general, which maybe we'll get into at the end. The primary one being that I think MOOCs are a reflection of a societal imperative to bring high-quality education at a low cost to global citizens. I think that's what's really driving all of this. But my story here today is much different, and it's really the story of a library that didn't want to be left out of the MOOC movement when its own institution was not participating, and so we just decided to do our own. Maybe it would help if I explained a little bit about my institution. Wake Forest is a small private research university in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Meg is a proud alum of Wake Forest, and she can tell you that it's a place where there are small classes, where you get to know your faculty members on a first-name basis, where you go to their house, where you have a close personal relationship. That is what Wake Forest stands for. So it prides itself on this up-close and personal kind of relationship, which is the exact opposite of what MOOCs are. This is my main point, I guess, which is that we as libraries have so much more to offer to the MOOC discussion than locating public domain materials or providing copyright assistance. That is certainly a valuable role that we can play, but it's not the only role that we can play. I believe that higher education is facing disruptive change like it has never seen in its 900-plus year existence. And I think that we as libraries have faced disruptive change very successfully in the past several decades. I've been a librarian since 1976, and we've had change every year. And I don't know any industry that has changed as much as libraries have. Now change is coming to higher education, and I think we have a role to play on our campus, and we can lead that change, lead the addressing change from the library, and that's what we have tried to do with this MOOC. This timeline is a very quick way for me just to walk through what exactly happened, and sorry if I have to turn and look at it. We teach a one and a half credit class, information literacy class at our library. And in the fall of 2011, we decided to teach 2 sections online. Wake Forest doesn't have any online courses in its undergraduate program. We had one developing course in graduate course in counseling, but nothing at the undergraduate level. So we just decided to experiment and try it. And we did, and it was very successful. The instructor said she had very close personal relationships with her students. They told her things online that they wouldn't tell her by sitting in a classroom, and she considered it to be a success. But the faculty on campus flipped out. They were very angry. They said, "Who told you you could do that?" And of course, we didn't ask for permission. So it started 2 years worth of governance discussions on the campus, and now finally they have voted and we're going to allow online classes, but it all started with our 2 sections. In February of 2012, I made a presentation to the Board of Visitors, the college, undergraduate college Board of Visitors, about that course. And they were interested in the online aspect, but they were also very interested in the information literacy aspect. And they said, "You're kidding, you have a class on how to manage information? Gee, I wish I had had that class when I was in school. And in fact, if you give that class again, I'd love to take that class, online or whatever." So that kind of got me thinking. Then all hell broke loose in the spring of 2012 with MOOC Mania. Coursera, Udacity, edX, everything she said. Teresa Sullivan got fired and rehired at UVA because they didn't think she knew enough about online education. So all that was going on in the background. In the summer of 2012, we hired a new e-learning librarian, fresh out of library school, to help teach that online graduate course in counseling. So in the fall of 2012, I will never forget, I was driving down to Beaufort, North Carolina with my husband, kind of grumbling that Wake Forest was not going to be part of a MOOC. I love MOOCs. I had taken 2 MOOCs by that time already. One on Beethoven sonatas and one on the ancient Greeks, just because I loved it. I'm a learner. I just thought it was terrific. So I finally said to him, well, if the university's not going to do it, we could just do it ourselves. We could just put our Live 100 class online and send it out to Wake Forest alums. So I took that challenge to our e-learning librarian, and he said, well, I can do that. And in the winter of 2013, he put it together, and it went live on March 18th. It lasted 4 weeks, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. And then we've had a second course since. It just finished on Monday. It was called Deacon Development 101. So let me tell you a little bit more about each one. The name of our library is Z. Smith Reynolds Library, but we call it ZSR. ZSR is like a person on campus. She's very friendly, very smart, funny. People love her. She helps you. So when we went to name the course, we named it ZSRX because you have to add X to everything, right? edX, TEDx, everything X. And then because it ended in RX, RX, we called it the Cure for the Common Web. And it was a short version of the information literacy course that we give to undergraduates. It was 4 weeks. These are the 4 modules that you'll see. It was basically how to search the web. So basic searching, advanced searching, privacy and filters, which is by far the most popular module, and then information management tools. We used Google Sites as a platform. We used Google Groups and Google Plus as discussion communities. We had hoped for 100 participants. I said to Kyle, if we could get 100 people to sign up, because we only marketed it to Wake Forest alumni, and there's only 40,000 alumni, so we marketed it, but we got 700 registrants. We were so happy. On 6 continents. They came from all over the place. We had many, many happy alumni and friends. I was reporting on the success of ZSRX to the advancement group, and the head of parent programs heard it and said, we're looking for ways to engage our parents, especially incoming parents, as their child starts Wake Forest. And maybe you could give that course again to new incoming parents. Could you do that? And I said, absolutely, because at Wake Forest, incoming parents are like the highest profile donor prospects. So of course I wanted to get out in front of the parents. So we, instead of adapting the original course, we decided to build a custom course for Wake Forest parents on what it means to be the parent of a college student today, how not to be a helicopter parent, how to let your child grow and develop and make their own decisions. And we reached out to offices all over the campus, in campus life, student life, everywhere. They helped us build the course, and we came up with Deacon Development 101. This time we used the Canvas platform. It's the free version of Canvas. We had 200 parents who signed up, and they were only on 3 continents. And we had 5 weeks and 5 modules. It was a required orientation for the first time, which was to get acquainted with the Canvas platform. There was a module on Gen Y. There was a session on academic development, and I had a module in that. The search for identity was the 4th, and then there was one on well-being, which is an initiative on our campus. We wrapped the whole thing up into what we call a parent's toolkit, and it is packaged now and lives on Google Sites. And you can go to our website in the library, and you can look at both of these courses. All the videos, all the reading materials, everything is still available online. Just the discussions are closed. I won't read the testimonials, but I'm here to tell you that people loved it. Just like any other MOOC, not everybody who started finished it. About half of the people who took the first ZSRX course interacted in some way with it. About 20%, as near as we can figure, made it to the end. But those who did absolutely loved it, and they kept gushing and saying, when are you going to do more? We want more topics. The second course is having likewise a very positive impact. It only closed on Monday, but as we were driving down here on Tuesday, I started seeing testimonials come in. One mother told us that it had changed her behavior toward her daughter because her daughter just told her she was changing her major to philosophy. And she said, my initial reaction would have been, how are you going to get a job with philosophy? But now it's, well, tell me about that. What is it that's interesting to you? So we made a difference in one family's life anyway. So we do have future plans. In winter, we're offering digital publishing MOOC, which I am hereby inviting all of you to take. Social media will be in the spring. And then our future plans are to try and partner with a public library to offer a genealogy course, and then perhaps with the business and health information sectors. We would like to partner with the medical library and with our business library. And also, we've thought that we could perhaps offer our platform to our own faculty. Since Wake Forest is not going to do any MOOCs on Coursera or edX anytime soon, perhaps they would want to do a chemistry course or anthropology course or whatever they think they can get an audience for. We could make our platform available and we could be the producers of that. But I think what we've demonstrated is that it is possible to create an open online learning community, and we did it in the Wake Forest way. The Wake Forest way is to be up close and personal, and we, through the discussions and so forth that took place, by having a limited number of people, we felt we could do that, and we learned a lot. Thank you.
So you were promised practical advice from me, and what you're going to get mostly at first is more philosophical advice. Good luck getting a job with it. And then I'll go into some practical recommendations. So as far as the way we think about MOOCs in libraries, I'm afraid that sometimes we worry too much about the motivations of those who are providing MOOCs. And other forms of alternative education. And what I'd like to do is sort of acknowledge up front the possibility and maybe even the likelihood that there are people offering MOOCs who want nothing but to make money. Some of these may actually be people who are conscious enemies of traditional higher education. And I'm not saying that motives don't matter, but while the motives of these folks are not entirely irrelevant, I think that it's important that we not be distracted by them when we think about what the future holds for us. The thought pattern that I use when I catch myself going down this road is to just remind myself that real life is not a movie, real life is not a novel in which you can assume that the person with the blackest heart is ultimately going to meet the worst fate. In real life, people and initiatives fail or succeed for reasons that have nothing to do with whether or not they're good people or bad people. So when it comes to making strategic decisions for ourselves, whether we're publishers or educators or librarians, discussions of the motivations behind MOOCs, I think, tend to be more distracting than useful. The reality is, I think, that MOOCs are emerging in a real marketplace of time and attention, and one in which students have to make difficult economic decisions. And the impact that MOOCs are having, and I think that they will continue to have in the future, doesn't hinge on whether or not we think MOOCs are a good idea. But it hinges on whether or not MOOCs solve a real problem for real people at a price that they will accept. A price in terms of money and a price in terms of time and attention. Now, there is a real problem. The real problem is that traditional higher education is very expensive. It's expensive in terms of money, and it's expensive in terms of time and attention. And an awful lot of people want it. There's the problem. To some degree, the people who want higher education want pure learning in order to improve themselves, in order to learn about things that are interesting to them, in order to become better people. But they also want certification. And currently, MOOCs do a better job of providing the former than they do of providing the latter, but that is going to change. Now, it's too soon to say exactly what's going to happen with MOOCs, but right now, I do think it's safe to say that traditional higher education's monopoly on post-high school education is eroding. And I'm concerned that we're wasting a lot of time and energy either evangelizing about MOOCs or demonizing them. And I think the reality is that the MOOC is a tool. It seems clear to me that MOOCs are here to stay because there's absolutely no reason for MOOCs to disappear. So I don't think the question is whether MOOCs are going to usher in the great day of an educational utopia or whether they're going to destroy the brains of our children. The question is, what do we do with this tool? How can we best use this tool to provide as much good in the world as possible? So with those questions and that sort of philosophical background in mind, speaking as a librarian, how is it that, or what is it that we as librarians should be thinking about when we're thinking about MOOCs? Why should we care about MOOCs? Now, apart from the question of libraries providing MOOCs, which is a wonderful topic, but one that I want to bracket for a second, for right now I want to talk about what is it, supposing that the university at which I'm a librarian starts going down the MOOC road, what does that university's MOOC behavior imply for impacts on the library itself in the course of its normal work? First of all, we in libraries normally restrict access to online information resources to currently enrolled students and staff and faculty, obviously. That's what our license terms require us to do, and the number of people that fit in that population is very often what defines the price that we pay for access to those online resources. However, we don't typically restrict access to our research services to people who are currently enrolled students or staff or faculty. Anybody can walk into the library and walk up to the reference desk and usually expect to get some kind of service. Now, that fact doesn't apply so much to MOOCs because most of the people enrolled in a MOOC are probably not going to be people in a position to walk into the library and come up to the reference desk. However, it's also true of telephone reference and reference chat services. We don't typically authenticate people who call us up or who send us a question over chat. We will typically provide that access to anybody. MOOCs, to the degree that they take hold and become prominent on our institutions, in our institutions, could very quickly force us to do one of two things: either to change that practice and to begin enforcing some kind of authentication, or to scale up. And scale is, I think, one of the great unexplored problems that we have in academic libraries when it comes to research assistance and traditional reference services. I've said this before, and I will probably say it 100 times again. The reason that we think our reference services work is that so few people that we're supposed to be serving actually try to use them. If, in fact, our reference services succeeded at serving, in my case, 32,000 students, they would immediately fall apart. MOOCs could force us to finally confront that issue and figure out a way to deal with it. And I want to emphasize, this is not a new issue. Scale is an old issue that we've just avoided confronting, I think. This is another interesting question for us in libraries, whether sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. And what I mean by that is that we in libraries, I find, tend to think that open access is a really wonderful idea as long as it threatens the traditional business of publishers. Once we start talking about open access solutions such as MOOCs that threaten the traditional business of higher education and libraries, all of a sudden we start getting very grumpy about openness. And I'll go one step farther and say that in my experience, the people who are most enthusiastic about OA in the scholarly publishing arena also seem to be the grumpiest about the concept of MOOCs in the higher education arena. Whereas those who take a more measured stance on openness are also, I find, a little more open-minded to the idea of MOOCs and the good and the bad that they can do. I think that one thing that we will find in libraries is that at institutions where there is more enthusiasm for the development and administration of MOOCs, there may also be more administrative pressure in the direction of open access policies or even mandates. Because obviously, locally produced open resources are going to be more useful in the MOOC environment than resources that are behind toll access walls or, and restricted by traditional copyright. So, this is my last slide. What do I think we in libraries ought to be doing right now? Three general categories with three fairly specific recommendations. The first one is, and Lynn, what Lynn has done at Wake Forest is such a perfect example of this. I think somebody ought to make a documentary film about what she and her crew have done in regard to MOOCs. we need to be, if in fact we in libraries believe that going down the road of MOOCs is a good idea, then we need to be taking the opportunity to show leadership. I can't say anything more except that look at what Lynn has done. All of us could be asking ourselves, how much of what we traditionally think of as bibliographic instruction could be turned into a MOOC that anybody, either on our campus or off our campus, could take advantage of? I think we also need to be looking for opportunities that the softening of the ground that MOOCs represent, we need to be looking at opportunities that softening provides. Personally, I suspect that MOOCs are going to destroy the traditional textbook market long before they destroy the traditional higher education market. Partly because traditional textbooks are already kind of on the ropes in a way that higher education isn't yet, but partly because the MOOC has the capability to perform a function very similar to textbooks, whereas the MOOC is not yet, I don't think, in a position to replace an awful lot of the desirable functions of a college experience. If, in fact, MOOCs pose a threat to traditional textbook publishing, libraries, I think, are in an unusually strong position to take advantage of that and to help that happen. And then the third thing that we need to do is take care. I believe very strongly in risk-taking. I also believe in due diligence. The Tony Robbins quote that Meredith used, I think, is worth considering here, where he said, the path to success is to take massive, determined action. That's absolutely true. What is not said in that quote is that is also the path to disastrous failure. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't take massive, determined action. It only implies the importance of due diligence. We need to know what we're getting into to a reasonable degree before we take the leap, and then I believe we need to take the leap. And I think I'll leave it at that.
And I have to start by giving my thanks to all three panelists. I think they did an excellent job of providing us a lot of things to think about, hopefully as a group, as this saga sort of unfolds. I'm going to turn it over to Anthony. I think we have about 20 minutes for questions,
We've got
Anthony.
plenty of time, yes.
Excellent. That was my plan.
Thank you, everybody. That was wonderful. Now, have we any questions? Any questions in here? No. Any questions in gold?
No questions in gold.
Any questions in colonial? Okay, I can see Sandy moving forward, but I'm going to just say something quickly. I've been to a number of presentations on MOOCs. They interest me. Are you a little worried by the fact that they seem, in many cases, to be something that happens and then doesn't seem to happen again? You have a MOOC, you do it, and then it goes away and doesn't repeat it. Am I right?
I'll be worried if that still happens in 10 years. I think we're very much at the beginning of this, and people are testing the waters a lot. And also, there's a lot of external institutional pressure in some places to try something, throw something at the wall and see what sticks. If nothing sticks in a while, then we're going to have to revisit this, and we're going to have had a massive determined failure.
But it does stick, doesn't it? I mean, it sticks because of the feedback you get. But then why don't you do it again? Are you doing yours again, Lynn?
We are doing it again. I think we need to enlarge our audience if we want to do the same course again, because I think we probably tapped out the Wake Forest alumni audience. So now we have to find a way to make it larger. I will say, though, that Coursera and others have repeated some of their MOOCs. I know that the first one I took has been offered again. And, but I do think, I agree with Meredith, is that we're in this intense experimentation stage. And I think it's okay to go from one thing to another to keep evolving to get to a more successful model.
And I'd just like to add that I think the attrition rate among MOOCs themselves as entities is in some ways similar to the attrition rate that we see among MOOC students, where, like Meredith said, you may be talking about 10,000 students. When you talk about an attrition rate of 90 or 98 or even 98%, I think you worry more about that rate in a system that is not as scalable as MOOCs are. The fact that MOOCs scale so well and so easily means that means that I think we should worry much less about rate than we should about raw numbers. If 10,000 or even 2,000 students successfully complete a MOOC, that MOOC was exceptionally successful, whether those 2,000 or 10,000 students represent 1% or 50% of the total number who enrolled. And I think a similar consideration applies when we talk about MOOCs themselves. If 1,000 MOOCs emerge in a year, and at the end of that year only 20 of them are still operating, and those 20 are successfully teaching between 500 and 2,000 students, that is a huge, huge development, regardless of what the actual percentages are.
Well, I'd just like to add as a comment there, if you take that paradigm that Rick has just described and you apply it to, let's say, the World Wide Web, for example, what percentage of information there is really useful in any way?
What has the impact been?
Exactly. So I think that phenomenon that he's just described is not restricted in any way to MOOCs. We're going to see it increasingly in a wider variety of things that are impacting our culture in other ways just outside of higher education.
Thank you very much. Sandy.
This is a question, Sandy Thatcher, formerly Penn State Press. Question for Rick, but I'd welcome answers from anybody in the panel. And the question is this: what do you think of the hypothesis that one primary effect of MOOCs may be to widen the gap between the elites and the non-elites among universities? And by that I mean that the Ivies are going to continue to stress that their low faculty student-faculty ratios, their personal experience type of education in small seminars and so on. The pressures of state universities like yours, and in the state where I now live in Texas, where the governor wants to have a $10,000 education for 4 years, puts emphasis on providing courses like MOOCs offer at a cheap way to educate a lot of people.
Right.
So it seems to me that this potentially widens that gap.
So my quick answer to that is, if the gap widens because the elite universities go up and the state universities go down, I have a problem with that. If the gap widens because MOOCs bring the state universities up but bring the elite universities up farther, I have no problem with that. Which of those might emerge is an open question.
I wanted to comment on that also. Wake Forest is ranked 23 in U.S. News and World Report, National Universities. And what I see is that everybody above us is doing a MOOC. Everybody below us, their students are taking MOOCs. Where does that leave us? If we're left out of that, we're on this island that's going to float away. So I think that's very relevant. And I think some people say that the top institutions are trying to kill the competition. If there's only going to be a few who will survive, they're going to be the ones to survive. And I want to be one of those survivors.
Okay, now, any questions from Colonial? Any questions from Gold?
No questions from Gold.
Okay, I have a question then. Are there librarians here that think that doing MOOCs or facilitating MOOCs is a bad or a good use of their time? Anybody like to say anything about that? Have I got any takers? Because it seems to me it's a relatively new area for librarians. Of course, they've always taught something, into the faculty, to the students, but the going outside in this way is relatively new, I think. And let me ask you this question. Can you justify this easily within the hard press? Librarians are having a terrible time, huge pressures on them, people being fired, everybody suffering. Why do you start doing MOOCs?
I'll answer that because we have 55 people on our staff. It's not a huge staff. We have one person who's devoting much of his time to doing this. But I think if we don't do it, we risk becoming irrelevant and we risk not having a future at all.
Also, MOOCs make the case for the continuing relevance of higher education and of libraries to the general public in much the same way that OA does, not actual public access for people who don't have institutional affiliations, not talking about who's funding what within the traditional academe, but if we're trying to make the case to the general public who's been out of school for 20, 30, 40 years that what we're doing is important and relevant in their lives, we need to start talking to them.
And I'll just add, I think that the answer, why do you do MOOCs, if you're a library, why do you do MOOCs in an atmosphere of constricted resources? The answer is the same as the answer would be to the question, why do you do anything in the library in an atmosphere of constricted resources? And that is, you do it because you feel that it's more important than something else that you could be doing instead. And that should, the problem is that we should be applying that same logic to everything that we do, not just new things that come down the road, but the things that we're doing today. We should apply it to journal check-in. We should apply it to traditional collection development. We should apply it to reference service.
Yeah, okay, I just want to make clear that I was acting as a devil's advocate here. It's not, okay. Sheila, please go ahead.
Sheila Correll, University of Pittsburgh High School. It's really just a response to Anthony's challenge there about whether librarians, felt strongly one way or the other. I was interested. I have an academic libraries course, which I am teaching this semester, and I have 40 students taking that, 20 of those on campus and 20 online. And one of the assignments I set was to invite the students to write a paper on the higher education context and issues in the current environment that are having an impact on libraries and likely to do so in the future. And they had to do a sort of brief review of what they thought were the key trends, then select one to explore in depth and discuss that. And it was interesting that out of that class, I think there were half a dozen chose MOOCs as their issue that they thought were worth exploring. And several of those linked that to the need for librarians to demonstrate the value that they added, the value of academic libraries and the value of librarians. And they were picking up a lot of the points that have been mentioned about opportunities for libraries and what they could do. And I thought that was interesting that so many of them, relatively out of that class and the number of things they could have chosen, actually chose MOOCs.
That's very helpful and interesting. Any comments on that? I mean, are librarians being taught this? Are librarians being taught about MOOCs? I know most librarians in the UK are not taught about things like data. I bet none of them are being taught about MOOCs, but in this country, are your instructors in library school teaching about MOOCs? Anybody know? Where's Mr. Professor Holly? Are you teaching about MOOCs in your institution?
I'm going to do it now.
Are you?
Yeah, I just decided I got some space in my syllabus, so I'm going to do it when I get back.
Okay.
We're so pleased.
Okay, we have a questioner here.
Hi, I'm Lisa Hooper from Tulane University down in New Orleans. I apologize for coming in late. I think I missed a lot of really good stuff, and I'm sad for that. But in the last presentation, you had a list of some of the problems facing libraries and MOOCs, and one of the many things that you highlighted were issues of licensing. And I think that's fantastic for librarians to become involved in MOOCs and embed ourselves in MOOCs for other classes, but who is leading the discussion on these licensing issues? Is it the industry? Is it librarians? Are teachers even thinking about it? Who is leading that right now? And I'm hoping you're actually the one who's leading it.
No, I'm not. And honestly, I'm not sure that there is an organized discussion on the topic yet. There may be one of which I'm not aware, and I would love to be made aware of it. I suspect, and I'm about 80% confident, that to the degree that the conversation is happening, it's happening on a very ad hoc basis. But I think that one of the reasons the conversation isn't really prominent is that I suspect, and I have reason to suspect, that an awful lot of MOOC instructors are limiting their readings to publicly available content. They are very consciously limiting their syllabi in that way. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not sure. I think that, well, no, I'm here to say that's not a good thing. I think that what would be much more effective for the students would be if the instructors were actually taking that step of saying, wait a minute, maybe there's licensed content that I can use. The problem is, once you start once you start including licensed content, you are effectively limiting the potential pool of students. So even as I'm talking, I'm going back and forth on this.
At the OCLC symposium on this last March, with the caveat that from March to November is eternity in internet years, some of the people spoke to this. HarvardX was very explicitly limiting their content only to open access as a matter of policy. But the other people who were talking said they were, usually it was the scholarly communication department at the university that was leading this conversation, and they said they had tried to include licensed content, but in most cases they just couldn't get a response. It wasn't even a no response, it was a no, we don't know who handles this, pocket veto. The only real effective exceptions they were getting there was when the instructor wanted to use their own traditionally published material and could contact their own publisher with whom they had a relationship. Now, since then, there have been these pilots led by the MOOC providers with various publishers to negotiate testing. I think that really hasn't come from the individual university. It's come between the publishers and Coursera and edX.
My only comment was the risk that the publishers run is becoming irrelevant if there are not more effective partnerships to, if students are taking MOOCs and they become an important tool, which I believe they may very well be, if your content's not there, when 100,000 students are taking Econ 101, your textbook just isn't that important anymore all of a sudden.
This is a follow-up on the licensing question. The question to you is this. You talk about open access, but some open access done under Creative Commons license that's CC BY NC raises the issue of whether the use by a MOOC provider who is a commercial company is a commercial use. What's your answer? It's being used in an educational context, but the company that's providing is commercial. So I don't think that's an easy question to answer.
No.
Okay, just checking upstairs first. Anybody upstairs, Gold?
No questions.
Have you got anybody there still? Yes?
Yes, we
Oh,
have
yeah,
people
good.
here.
You stick. What about, is that Glenda? Yes, it is Glenda. And what about Colonial?
No, we don't have any questions, Anthony.
Okay, now please go ahead. Sorry.
Thanks. Heather Staines from SIPEX, and I just had to follow up on the licensing question because it's crazy. And the communications that we're having are not just with publishers, because a lot of times the older, more classic content, particularly literature, that the professors want to use in the courses is no longer controlled by the publisher, so then you're back to like the large agencies. And they're like, MOOC? What? And then in some high-profile courses we've worked on, it's actually the estate. Try explaining a MOOC to the Winston Churchill estate. Now, in all fairness, they went for
They're
it.
here.
They were willing to go for it, and we applaud them, but it's a long conversation because it does typically come back with, okay, that's going to be $85,000 for those students. And then we say, okay, it's not required. This is a free course. This is for the students who want to purchase. But publishers are starting to open up to this. So the conversations now are much easier than the conversations were in December of last year. And it's heartening that publishers are willing to experiment. Mm-hmm. And the licensing, I would say if I got a piece of content and it had a CC by NC, I would go to that publisher. We want to make sure in all cases that we're covered. But it brings up a lot of interesting questions, about what the publisher business model is and such, but it's a brave new world.
And for those who don't know this, a lot of people here I'm sure do, but for those who don't know, Heather works for a company called SIPEX that does basically disintermediated by the article access on behalf of end users in cooperation, I want to make sure I'm summarizing this the right way, in cooperation with libraries typically.
Yes.
But when Heather talks about our conversations, she's talking about conversations between her company and publishers. And SIPEX wants to make it possible through their product, their service, for students to get this access to non-licensed content that's under copyright.
Yes.
Yeah.
You didn't even have to say that, Heather. Isn't that a wonderful thing? So, thank you very much.
you.
And the lady here who's got a question.
Melissa Belvati from University of Prince Edward Island in Canada, which is relevant. the international aspect of the copyright issues and the licensing issues. Canada already has, as of some recent changes in the last year, much more liberal concept of fair dealing than the U.S. fair use, and it's being discussed among academic librarians right now as to whether MOOCs in Canada could actually provide entire journal articles without any permission at all. The law is at the point where it is actually a debatable issue. And if you go even beyond Canada to other countries around the world which have very limited intellectual property protection, what might be the issues where an American university might be able to partner with a university in another country to make sure the data and the course is being served out of servers in that country, and that might change the whole game.
So,
I'm not a lawyer.
things are becoming
I would
incredibly...
suggest you talk to one. I recommend Kevin Smith. Is he here?
No, Kevin's gone. He came on Wednesday. He
Murkier by the moment.
too busy to stay here, I'm afraid. No. Okay, John, you have a question.
Yes, as I mentioned, all of us should be taking a MetaMOOC, and I took mine on behalf because Mike Sweet asked me to take a MOOC and then report back what it was like. So then we both learned about a lot of this stuff. So I'm just going to mention a couple of things that I've learned that we haven't touched on. Some of it comes from interviewing Daphne Kohler, who's one of the co-founders of Coursera. And she was very excited to say that it was their 5th quarter, and this was just in June, that they now had $250,000 worth of revenue. It all came from a little bit of tweaking some of the authentication schemes. So now you type in a sentence or two, and they can tell that it was you who was typing. Of course, they can't tell that your brother might have been in the next room reading you all the answers, but whatever, they get $39 from that, and that added up to $250,000. Now, that doesn't support 40 people, but she says that she has like 20 or 30 other business plans in terms of monetizing this. However, she's pretty firm about the fact that her audience is not the traditional American higher ed student. She's on this worldwide mission of what it means for all kinds of people around the world, and the whole third world, and places where, yes, there's internet connection, but almost no infrastructure for higher education. And to be able to provide this, I think, is a really significant part of the MOOC question. There's a very good extended section in the most recent issue of Scientific American on the whole question of education technology, and in particular MOOCs, and I highly recommend it to everyone. It's, and indeed, all of you should get in there and take your MetaMOOC.
Now, any other questions from upstairs? Gold?
No questions.
Colonial? Well, I think just want to say one thing. The company the organization which somebody mentioned in the UK, I'm trying to get out of the light, it's called Future Learn, and it's got quite an interesting site. Now, Future Learn is actually a private company, but it's wholly owned by the British Open University, which has been in this similar sort of business for many years. It's well worth looking into. I think they're making a real investment in this, okay? So I want to now thank everybody on the panel and all the audience for staying, rewarded.
Thank you.
And enjoy the conger eel this evening, okay?